Hello and welcome.
Hiya.
Back.
We're back again.
Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, it's Rocket League, so it's a good thing.
It is a good thing.
Oh fuck! I just realised my thumb. This is gonna be fun.
Yeah, we've had an injury this week. Bilious. Show up your injury.
I can't put it down, so thumbs up all around.
Yeah. So we're back. A couple of topics today. Obviously, the controversial 12-pin from NVIDIA. We have also got the world's biggest 3D printer prints. Obviously, a multi-story building. That's going to obviously change the game when it comes to affordable housing, I think, which is a good thing. We've also got competition for NVIDIA in the AI accelerator space. AMD EPIC to power obviously Google's cloud services, which is pretty interesting, but not unsurprising with obviously Intel stagnating for so long. JEDEC obviously publishes new specs for their GDDR5, which again pretty much expected to come through. Probably I don't see anything mass production wise until probably 2021. And then availability probably in 2022. And then, of course, AMD's Navi Flounder GPU. I want to get straight into it. Couple of warm-up rounds. Haha.
Yeah. I'm coming from mouse and keyboard back to console. Always trips me out.
Yeah.
Well,
And yes, I play Rocket League mouse and keyboard. Don't judge me.
So the first topic, obviously, this week, we're going to get started on the controversial 12-pin.
controversial. It sounds like a really, really good idea. Everyone wants to buy a new power
Yeah,
supply.
my lovely Seasonic titanium power supply that I have.
Which is, what, less than 6 months old?
Yeah.
I from what I can tell, this is just going to be on the Founders Edition cards from the information that we've been provided so far in the
not
leaks.
just for like quadros and whatnot? Is it actually going to be
potentially that'll probably go down to across their stack. They'll probably unify it across all their product lines.
Yeah.
But yeah, as far as it goes,
Have they said why?
as far as it goes, I think it's just one of those situations where I think tapping into Samsung's less mature node versus TSMC, I think the power draw on these new cards is going to be quite high. Everyone's always, sort of put AMD in the bad light with power draw versus performance. I think this time around it's going to be either very close or a situation where AMD might have a slight upper hand, especially with obviously the fact that they've been putting their APU technology obviously to good use in the consoles, trying to obviously optimize GPU efficiency in that regard. I think that will translate across to their
Sneaky beaky.
their desktop GPUs as well, coming around this generation, especially with obviously a matured TSMC 7nm process node.
The previous generation, they said that they'd get a 50%.
That's it, yeah. Navi
2X,
2X, which is 50% power efficiency per watt.
The new one, they're obviously going for the same.
And like I said, it's one of those situations where from current leaks that we've sort of had circulating, that target is actually set to be, if rumours are true, of course, that's set to be obviously the situation. They're looking at essentially 40 to 50% more powerful than 2080 Ti on their flagship GPU, which is not bad. That's a pretty decent, step up. Yeah. And of course, the biggest thing is once they get that performance, the biggest thing, next move is going to be obviously maintaining it, like they've done with their Zen architecture, because like the Zen architecture from its early inception to its current iteration has constantly gotten to that point where they've nailed it basically with every generation improvement that they've had so far. So of course with 4th gen on the horizon, Zen 3 architecture, that'll be interesting. Yeah, they're definitely rising from the ashes. That's a pretty old meme by now, obviously. So we'll just go and obviously show some of the information. Tech Power up here.
So have we got a Any information?
As far as it goes, no, it's their own standard on the 12 pin.
Okay, so this isn't going to be an opened up sort of spec. They're closing it down more so. Or do we not sort of get know any sort of that information?
As far as it goes, I believe that it is going to be a situation where it's going to be their own sort of spec.
They're going to start pulling out fucking an Intel and reheating their CPUs in GPU form. Or are you expecting Navi to not be scaring them too much? They've just got bigger sort of quotas to fill in terms of production of the cards themselves, and Samsung has just offered a better price than what TSMC can do.
I think that for the most part, it's more a situation where I think that it was a situation where Nvidia, for the most part, were looking at trying to obviously bring in a cheaper price point for their upcoming GPU. And as a result, they were trying to get it so that they were basically competing, pegging basically TSMC and Samsung against each other. And obviously, they would have probably put some production over probably to Samsung. The lower end cards have been in the past made on Samsung for some SKUs. The 1050, for example, was a Samsung die.
Oh, okay.
It's not always the case, but like I said, it just depends on what capacity they can get a hold of and how mature the node is, what yields they're getting, that sort of stuff. So it's not like this isn't the first time that they've used Samsung, and like I said, it probably won't be the last. It's not quite clear because the connector basically doesn't even allow for 2 6 pins to go into it. It was one of the rumors going around that it was just the ability to sort of join the 2 6 pins together and make it one 12 pin.
Yeah.
Which to me would have made a lot more sense because if you haven't got a power supply with a new 12 pin. But they're going to have to ship adapters in the box. This is going to add obviously some cost, of course, to the consumer. It always does. Irrespective of whether or not it's a couple of cents to a couple of dollars, it's still going to add cost. But for me, this is one of those situations where I think the idea of this whole connector is going to be probably moot anyway, because there was talk of, with a PCIe Gen 5 standard, that they were going to integrate the power delivery directly through the graphics card, similar to what Apple has already done in their Mac Pro.
Oh, okay. So the AMD cards in those are powered by the...
Yeah, so you just slot the graphics card in, and it sends up to 500 watts through the slot.
Oh, crap.
Yeah.
Seriously?
Yep, seriously. Because
So
it is a
there's
dual
that much-
GPU architecture.
Yeah, but still, 250 watts... I mean, 500 watts is a lot more than 75.
Yeah. Oh, they've got to obviously peak load, etc., that sort of stuff. They've obviously got to go future-proofed, obviously, the slot
Exactly,
too for next
but,
generation.
I mean,
but
typically,
it's-
we don't see much more than sort of 250
it's one of those things
watts.
where from
Yeah.
some leaks, I'm not sure if these are actually accurate. Like I said, I mean, if PCIe Gen 4 is not even available on Intel's platform yet. And of course, it's going to be probably another year at least before we see it there.
At this rate, Intel will be cancelled by the time PCIe Gen 5 comes out.
But as far as it goes, it's one of those situations where PCIe Gen 5, if it does integrate it into the slot, it makes obviously cable management a lot easier, especially if you sort of have it where you can plug the power connectors for obviously your graphics card directly on the motherboard. It just means that obviously more complex and potentially more expensive motherboards, if they've got to obviously allow for extra tracing for the delivery. But I mean, that's again quite a ways off before we'll see that in mainstream user
You're taking us online?
domains.
Yeah, good courage.
Yeah, as far as it goes, there's a couple of pictures obviously in relation to the
Yep.
layout of the socket.
Click what?
Like I said, it pretty much is what it is.
Oh,
It's
sorry.
just a proprietary 12 pin. All one side is essentially ground. All one side is obviously 12 volt plus pins. Not much different, like I said, to the 6 essentially layout, where the top 3 pins are of course ground, bottom 3 pins 12 volt. But like I said, it is unfortunately being pinned out differently so that the socket is obviously incompatible. So that's that there. Transition back over to. It's one of those things where it's going to be interesting to see whether or not this actually does come out. Apparently, it can provide up to 600 watts of power with high gauge wiring, which is the main focus. And that obviously comes down to the fact that they obviously, like I said, looking at either potentially going all out with a dual GPU configuration potentially to basically exert dominance over AMD's graphics solution, which has not something that hasn't been done in the past. Like AMD and Nvidia have done that both in the past, where they couldn't get a card to compete on the very top end, so they just slapped 2 GPUs together just to make sure that they were on top dog basically. So it'll be interesting to see if that's the solution here, that they know that there's even if it's just a situation where they may even potentially have that card set for release, it's just in the works as a stopgap if AMD's obviously Navi 2X graphics cards do get to that point where they do compete at that level. They could just obviously bring out another product that would sit above their current lineup of cards. I'm interested to see whether or not their whole rumored RTX 3090 card actually does come out. To me, that sort of makes the card a situation where I think potentially what I think that they're trying to do, if they do bring that card out, is to reorganize the stack, because a lot of people don't associate Titan cards with gaming because they're out of that sort of, they're more of a enthusiast niche product that they don't get considered as part of the graphics card lineup. I mean, even though it does still sit in that stack, it's more of a compute workstation level, card. It's not for the mainstream, even though it's available for mainstream. It's just too expensive for most people to even consider a mainstream card. And I think that's why they might be looking at reorganizing the stack, because if they obviously bring out a 3090, that card would obviously be aimed for consumer mass obviously production. Whereas, like I said, the Titan cards just don't go into that sort of level, and that would then either bring the stack up another tier in between Titan and the TI 3080, or go down the path of bringing the stack down, where essentially the 3090 is essentially top tier, and the 3080 Ti is essentially what a 3080 would have been if they had not redone the stack. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Cool. Now, this is pretty interesting. Next tech topic. You just don't have anything more to say about the 12 pin?
I just hope they don't do it on the one that I'm going to buy.
As far as it goes, from it looks like that the AIB partners won't be using it. It'll be just the Founders Edition cards. It may get adoption down the track, but I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. Yeah. The biggest thing is that I think from AIB partners, they're not going to go down the path of a new connector when they've probably already got inventory of thousands, if not millions, of already currently available connectors. It's going to obviously add additional costs to their product. And like I said, I mean, this was also shot in obviously labs as well, so there's nothing to say that they might actually change the final release product at the end of the situation. And some of this could also be coming out too because of the weird design of the current Ampere cards.
True.
If that card design is accurate, I mean, it could be a design situation where by having essentially one 12-pin connector, that small amount of space that they do save on having that all in one connector rather than having it split across two, could obviously be an issue that's a solution to a problem. We don't know. We'll have to just wait and see. Moving on to the 3D printed two-story building.
So this is Europe's first. Not so much a world first. Obviously, China's been doing it for a while now,
yeah.
but it's sort of reaching more of a global and realistic level.
What does it use, like material-wise?
A lot of it's concrete based, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah. And it's no different to essentially any other sort of 3D printing sort of situation. Like I said, it's one of those situations where it's just very thin layers, multiple levels of very thin layers.
Yeah, the only main difference is it doesn't make a shitty phone case. It makes something to live in.
Yeah. And I mean, it's one of those situations where, I mean, this technology is definitely not new. I mean, it's been around for a little while. I've seen a couple of articles in relation to, obviously 3D printed houses being the norm. I mean, there's one that actually uses recycled plastic to produce the 3D printed house. Now, certain types of, obviously, recycled plastic. Yeah. You just basically throw the recycled plastic in the machine and it obviously melts it down and turns it into a house. Which, I mean, is a great environmental, notion. Although the quality of that does come down to the quality of the plastic that you're obviously recycling. So obviously quality control issues and stuff like that. Some, obviously, jurisdictions will have issues with that, recycling plastic in that regard.
Check out these nerds.
But I mean, it is definitely a situation, obviously, reducing how obviously environmental impact.
Yeah.
And it's one of those situations where you got to understand, in like China, they actually have a mandate where those buildings have actually got a limited lifespan. They actually have to be pulled down and rebuilt. They can't be left standing for extended periods of time. So as a result of that, obviously that's why they obviously have to look at really cheap ways of producing buildings.
Yeah.
And of course, with their oversupply of buildings currently that are currently empty and vacant, and we're talking not just one high rise here and there, we're talking whole cities. That's going to obviously be probably a big issue economically coming down the line, where these cities are going to end up basically turning to rubble before they even get lived in.
Well, I know I saw a while back there was a video of those like Mars landing houses they were 3D printing.
Yeah.
It's the same sort of idea. It's
Yeah, and I mean, it's one of those things where, I mean, the use cases are quite profound, especially like, after a tragedy like a hurricane or cyclone, trying to get obviously people back into some sort of level of accommodation. Because, I mean, the impacts on some of those, I mean, we know firsthand with bushfires last year,
I'll save it.
That was quite devastating to a lot of people.
Yeah.
But getting them back into their own home, being displaced for not only weeks but potentially months, if not years, has happened in the past, and it's just purely because the way that the wheels turn, with all that sort of stuff. There's not really much to show in relation to this one. It's just a quick.
Is it like, I don't know, how technical is it? Is it like just the outside and the frame, or was it put plumbing?
It's just showing you the 3D printer setup, obviously with the first sort of layer done.
I'm sorry.
Like I said, as far as it goes, there's obviously more photos available online, but
yeah,
it's that pay to win skins.
32 feet by 32 feet 3D printer is used.
Yes.
And of course, it prints out the shell of the house. Like, I mean, as far as it goes, there are certain things that you still have to go down the path of, obviously, doing manually, which is like, electrical, water, plumbing, that sort of stuff. All that sort of those bits and bobs have to be obviously implemented into it.
Quick score.
And then moving right along to NVIDIA's rival in the AI space.
Yes. I thought that was very interesting with the new, what company was it?
British chip designer British chip designer Graphcore recently unveiled its Colossus MK2.
I didn't read it too thoroughly, but I know when I read into it, it was is it 16? Is it petaflops? Is that what they call them? Petaflops.
I'm looking.
Start searching
Through
for an
the-
online match. Oh, it's just searching.
Right.
Yeah, the biggest thing is the price to performance. I mean, it offers a GC200 offers cheaper per petaflop processing power than what obviously Nvidia are offering, and that obviously makes a big difference when it comes to people, like I said, investing in this sort of stuff for obviously actually potential use cases. Especially when you're looking at working on multi data sets at the same time. Like, you know, that's the thing. It's one of those situations where, you know, we're, you know, obviously looking at it from a consumer perspective where we, you know, would be hard pressed to, you know, own 2 or 3
Wait, what colour are we?
high-end desktop/server systems.
Are we blue or orange, Carl?
Blue.
Whereas, yeah, they're looking into going down the
I think it
path
was the
of,
size of it as well, and they've shrunk it quite a lot. They're saying about it's like the same size as a pizza box.
yeah, it looks pretty interesting. Like 16 exaflops.
Exaflops, that was it. Was it 13.7 billion years a person would have to do one calculation every second
Yeah,
to do what it does.
31.7 billion years to match what one exaflop system can do in a single second.
That's right. That's only 2 sort of ages of the universe is put together.
Yeah.
So pretty much
Get started.
if you got the whole of the entire Asian population, it still wouldn't work. You'd still be faster using one of these machines.
It's ridiculous.
Which is quite ridiculous. I mean, it's just one of those things where this is it. There's competition now in that game, that space, because there's money there, and it's one of those things where I think that's where, for the likes of AMD and obviously Intel, they're obviously going to sort of probably be looking at moving into those spaces a lot heavier over the next few years as well. Hence the big move from obviously Intel into graphics, because that's essentially the scalability factor for the whole AI data set.
And Nvidia's come out before and said that they're not a gaming company.
They're not anymore, no. I mean, their
they've
market
got
cap
their
just
start.
recently surpassed Intel, and that's purely on the back of the fact that Intel hasn't been innovating. I mean, they've obviously still got way more money coming in than what Nvidia do, but it's one of those situations where, you know, obviously market analysis basically is what trends those things, and market perception. But the biggest thing is that it's one of those situations where you got to look at it from a perspective of where the technology's going and who's leading that charge. That currently is Nvidia.
Yeah.
You know, it's not Intel. It's certainly not Intel at the moment. And like I said, that's the thing. It's one of those situations where, like, I'm no obviously financial expert or anything like that, but you know, if you're going to be betting money, you're going to be betting on money that's been doing the research in this, you know, domain for the last 10 years, because they're obviously going to put a lot more R&D into the market. And that's the thing, the same situation when you look at it from a perspective of, you know, AMD versus Intel. You know, Intel were sitting on their hands and obviously not investing very much back into their R&D, because obviously if they were, they wouldn't be in that situation where, you know, AMD was able to come back and obviously trounce all over them in regards to their whole Zen architecture being launched, and to the point where, like, now it's one of those situations where you've even got like the likes of Linus this week actually throwing out a video that basically says, what the hell is Intel trying to do? You know, locking down their lower end chipsets to the point where, you know, it makes it a situation where, from a gaming perspective, you cannot recommend buying, you know, an i5 10400 because that chip just does not make sense with a constrained memory bandwidth limitation. It makes that product essentially uncompetitive across everything, except for obviously some maybe OEM pre-built machines for office use. But I mean, from a you know, mass production, you know, mass adoption sort of standpoint. Like, I mean, you know, you and I and Billy, we all work in the retail sector.
Yeah.
We sell these products. We're not going to recommend something to a customer that's inferior.
No.
It's just something that, you know, I mean, bang for buck, we're always going to recommend the top dog in value for money. I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean the top dog in terms of performance. It just means the best value proposition. And like I said, currently that's an AMD product for the most part. That's the reason why I bought the Asus TUF A15. The AMD processor in this thing is just insane for the value. To the point where, I couldn't recommend buying an Intel laptop currently to pretty much anyone at the moment. The only downside is that availability is the biggest issue currently.
Yeah. I want to back on the AI side of things. I know with the Blender and the Photoshop stuff that I do, it's the deep learning and the AI systems they've even incorporated into that. Was say you render a scene out, and the amount of processing power you need to render it, and basically keep re-rendering all the light trace paths and all that over and over again to make sure the picture looks perfect. There's no grains in it. You need a hefty system to do that. With all these new AI and denoisers they're putting out, you can have like your old school laptop render out a scene that looks super, blurry, and all the light trace paths.
And I think again that's where I think the whole big argument from Apple moving away from obviously Intel Silicon to their own custom silicon is where their move is, because they can just add obviously hardware baked in features like AI processing directly into their own silicon. That then it basically makes it moot when it comes to doing some of those workloads. And of course they've got a lot of clout with big players in the professional space, audio and video, as well as obviously photo editing. So obviously they're going to obviously build those processes to obviously accelerate certain workloads that are obviously being used by those people.
Yeah, well, it's like with Photoshop and the Adobe system, they're using the AI and databases to, like I know the tool, they've changed the name of it again, but it's like they call it the Band-Aid tool, and it's where you basically draw over a picture and an image, and it will use basically an AI system to see what's around what you've drawn, and it will remove it with a digitally created version of the surrounding area. So if there's a rock on the sand you don't want, you brush over the rock, and it would basically replace it with the surrounding sand texture.
Yeah.
And it's not just a copy and paste tool like the clone stamp. It actually uses an AI-based system.
Yeah. And again, you look at even like last week's episode with the deep fakes.
Yeah.
Like that sort of stuff is going to become a situation where that'll be the norm. Actors won't actually necessarily have to actually have any talent.
No, they just have to get 3D scanned or something.
They just basically get a 3D scan, and of course they then do get the actors to do maybe a bit of the voice, just so that they've got a voice profile. And of course it'll be one of those situations where you won't actually be paying an actor to actually act, you'll just be paying them for their likeness.
Yeah, you're paying for a license of their face, basically.
Yep. And that's it.
They'll be able to make the perfect character for every movie and not have to...
Well, that's it. It's one of those situations where, especially when it's got saga type, shows where, the characters essentially, multiple generations, they age a lot quicker, obviously, than what the movies are made. Harry Potter was a prime example of that situation where obviously the actors were essentially getting to the point where by the end of the series they were essentially no longer the age that they were sort of in some cases meant to be reflecting. And of course that's going to obviously be a situation where they have to use obviously old tricks to fix those sorts of things. Like obviously making people look taller or shorter than what they're supposed to, and obviously using a lot of makeup. But if you can AI that sort of stuff, that'll obviously cut down a lot of the production time. And I think that's too the costs. Like you look at the budgets on some of these movies now. Like you look 10 years ago, it wasn't unheard of to have a movie being made that was 50-60 million dollars. Now some of those movies are nearly the $200 to $300 million in production costs. Those are big numbers. And of course, the biggest problem now with obviously the whole lockdown situations that we're all in, people aren't going to the movies. They can't go to the movies. It's one of those situations where those Hollywood producers now have to sort of rethink how they're going to produce movies on a much more shoestring budget. Because like I said, that factor has definitely changed. And like I said, industry changing, I think, across the board based on this whole, lockdown situation, human malware position. Every industry, I think, across the globe is rethinking the way that they do business. And I think that's going to be the biggest driver with innovation over the next probably 5 to 10 years. And like I said, that's going to obviously mean that, like I said, utilizing features like AI are definitely going to be a bigger part to a lot of people's business. And the biggest thing is that this situation with the whole human malware as well. Like, I mean, using AI to try and come up with a solution has been one of those situations where, and data crunching, just large data sets, has been one of those things where that's driven, I think, again, a lot of the rise in NVIDIA's stock price, because, they are the company to go to for, obviously, the workhorses that do that sort of work. We'll move on to... What about you, Billy? Do you have anything to add to that?
Not too much. No, it's pretty much just covered it.
Now,
the other thing I was going to mention though was the idea of games utilizing the ability to do what these data center AI chips are made for. Like in the way that we've got the ray tracing cores now on NVIDIA to do the ray tracing. Having the similar sort of compute idea, but to do things for like AI that can learn on the fly in a game. So say, for example, you're playing a racing game and it's the AI will adapt and learn to your driving style to make opponents just the right amount of difficulty for you and things like that.
New gaming experiences based on that. And like I said, not just that, like it's one of the situations where, like I said, it comes down to even things like in medicine, that sort of stuff, like having it where you can throw in a bit of information about a patient and obviously get spat out, a lot more, specialized treatments and stuff like that. That's where a lot of that sort of stuff is going to make everything, like I said, the new paradigm shift.
Or even just like some new hectic ass.
It'll be essentially the era of AI quite
that
profoundly.
Was something that Carl mentioned to me was like a horror game that could like learn and adapt on the fly to what scares you the most.
Especially if you obviously hooked it up to a heart rate monitor on a wristwatch. So as your essentially heart rate increases based on essentially how obviously scared or whatever you are, that would be an interesting philosophy and how way to do it, especially if it was a VR type game.
Well, it's like that Black Mirror.
Oh yeah.
Oh
dude, that one was that ending was a bit how you going? How's your mother? Literally, how's your mother?
So we'll move on to the next topic, and that was in relation to obviously Google going down the path of using Epic processors in their new cloud services, which is again not obviously something that we haven't obviously already been.
It's just good to see sort of some of the big boys, or not so much good, but just interesting really to see some of the big boys, big names not using Intel. Which
I think it's again. I think this is the transition.
You faked me. I thought you hit it.
Oh, I tried. I'm just bad.
I think this is the transition that we're getting across to. Obviously, the thing is like I said, it's one of those situations with these big companies. They can't just throw obviously their contracts out and start again at a whim. Those contracts are 2, 3, 4, 5 years out for some of these things, and of course it's one of those situations where it does take time to change. And I think the biggest thing is that we're finally starting to see obviously the fruits of the labor that AMD has actually laid. It's one of those things where they've got a competitive product that's got less obviously security issues than Intel, that customers are actually after, that scales really well, especially across obviously power and performance, not just one or the other, both, which is again another big playing part into the whole data center situation. They don't just look at obviously the raw performance. It's also a power and heat situation that they have to sort of look at too. Those budgets to cool those systems is just as high, if not more, than just turning them on. Those data centers, like I said, they can generate quite a lot of heat and suck through a lot of power. So it's good to see that. Like I said, it's one of those things where now that we've obviously started seeing the Threadripper Pro stuff, we're going to probably obviously see a lot of the AMD stuff scale down the market now. I think a lot more into the workstation environment. So a lot of your Pixar animation, DreamWorks, those sort of places will probably start using those processors, because obviously they can deploy one of those machines, and what would normally take 2 or 3 Intel servers can be probably done on one
socket
machines now, with the amount of processing power that those EPIC chips have, and the fact that now they've got the volume of memory that they can obviously support, being bumped out to 2 terabytes. That's going to obviously change the game, and of course multiple GPUs, which a lot of the stuff can obviously be accelerated through, obviously again with AI. Be interesting to see that over the next few years.
Is that us?
I blame playing with my mates last night. They were all like pros, so I think it's boosted my elo a bit too high.
You need to be brought down a peg or two.
Yeah, this is good. Losses is what we did.
Moving on to the next tech topic that we've got today, and that was in relation to JDEC publishes new DDR5 standard for advancing next generation high performance computing systems.
Right, do it. What are they?
Well, I mean, obviously speed is going to be again the main push, and capacity.
Voltage going down?
As far as it goes, not to the extent that we've seen in the past.
Well, it's still going from 1.2 to 1.1 as the base.
Yeah. The voltages will go down. I mean, this is JDEC spec too, though, so you got to remember that most of your performance kits don't run at JDEC spec. So your 3600 CL16 kits won't run at the 1.2 volt. They'll generally be 1.35 or something like that. So I mean, this is more just in line with the more red book, tech specs basically of what the basic standard is. And that's the thing, that's again coming back into that situation with the whole Intel thing. Like, technically running it out of JDEC spec is technically an overclock according to them. So like I said, JDEC specs are going to make a big difference in terms of performance when you're obviously looking at using those specific settings. But yeah, as far as it goes, for the most part, the JDEC specs are pretty much as what we were expecting. Speeds will obviously start at roughly around the 3200 and then sort of go up from there. Like I said, it's one of those things where this sort of stuff is always a lot slower to transition, especially in the climate that we're in now. It'll be one of those situations where, like I said, I don't really see full adoption on this on the consumer side of things probably up front. I'd say that they'd probably look at utilizing this on the more higher end products, Threadripper Pro, obviously Epic, those sorts of things first. Those sorts of products will obviously make more of a benefit from it. High memory bandwidth to try and get the data into the multi-core CPUs quicker. But for the average home user, I don't think it's going to be a situation where they're going to obviously be as very aggressive with it. Especially with the cost of GDDR5 when it launches, will be relatively expensive.
Finish her off for me.
As far as it goes, it's always one of those situations where supply and demand is the driving factor of these sorts of things. And like I said, if there is going to be relatively decent demand and very limited supply, which generally with the ramp up of these sorts of products is, look at the GDDR6 on the graphics cards. That added significant costs to the manufacturing of the new GPUs. That obviously has now started to come down to the point where they've even trickled it down into their lower end products, because it's now actually cheaper to buy GDDR6 than it is to buy the GDDR5, because production of GDDR5 has slowed down, and of course supply is limited. That means it's going to cost more because there's not as much supply. So NVIDIA's moved to obviously use GDDR6 in the lower end SKUs of graphics cards. It's sort of indicated that at that transition point now has occurred. There's going to be obviously a transition over to the GDDR5 in that regard.
Sorry, I didn't realize you were going for it.
It'll be interesting to see, like I said, who will actually be the first out to the block essentially with DDR5.
Samsung.
As far as it goes, Micron's actually looking at already starting to validate a lot of their stuff. Samsung's probably already in the works of doing their own. But, I mean, the platform that takes it on first is going to be the interesting one. Whether or not Intel can afford to do that first, or if it's going to be an AMD first to move over to DDR5. To me, I would say it would probably be more likely an AMD thing. given the fact that they are looking at obviously probably having the flexibility of using the IO die, they don't have to change the whole actual package of their chip. They can literally just change out one component, which is the AI die, IO die. That chip can be changed out without having to change the rest of the package, and then that controller on that can then convert from GDR 4 to 5 quite simply without having to actually change the product itself from a fundamental architectural change. The chiplets can still remain as they are. So this could even be a situation where they may even actually go down the path of co-launching two different product lines at the same even time on some of their platforms. Ones that support older DDR4, some that support DDR5, and essentially use the same chiplet architecture, but be obviously limited by memory controller, which isn't something they've dealt with that in the past. They have had situations where the
6th gen,
the Phantom series chips, some of those actually had different pinout, and they had dual memory controllers enabled on them, so that they could either work with DDR2, DDR3. So I mean, there's nothing to say that they can't do a similar situation here. They can put a newer chip onto, an older chip onto a newer board, but a newer chip onto an older board, sort of thing. There's cross socket compatibility, and that's just having obviously some redundant pins available that they can utilize those. Be interesting to see. I mean, ASRock's generally the motherboard manufacturer to bring out weird motherboard designs, so it'd be interesting to see if they do a hybrid solution. And I mean, Intel, even when they moved over to Skylake, they had DDR3 version boards as well as DDR4 version boards available, so it's not like that hasn't happened in the past there, so that'll be interesting. Anything more that we need to discuss in relation to the...
Not too much to touch on DDR5 just yet. We'll have to wait for some more details, timings and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think Intel's probably a little bit more ways off. And I mean, as far as it goes, I think that their whole move away from essentially a core increase trajectory like that AMD have sort of gone down the path of, they want to obviously look at going down the path of big little type design CPUs, which is sort of a weird design methodology. Like, I mean, I'm not sure how well that'll actually translate. It'll be interesting to see how those cores interconnect, because I mean, I was looking at sort of a theory where, I mean, there's nothing to say that they don't run a dual ring bus design with a common I/O die sort of in the center, and having essentially the little cores on one ring bus and the big cores on a separate one. But yeah, trying to have them all on the same, essentially, how are they going to actually get all these cores to communicate, especially considering they're going to be running at different clock speeds, obviously different instruction sets, that sort of thing. It's going to be an interesting design philosophy. But I reckon a dual ring bus would make sense, because it's one of those situations where they can increase core count without essentially going down the path of having to look at utilizing essentially more radical design layout like they have with their high-end platform, which is their net mesh architecture, which tanks, not dramatically, but it does have a detrimental performance hit when it comes to gaming. That architecture definitely has a disadvantage in the gaming realm, hence the reason why they've been trying to push ring bus out to its essentially current 10-core monster. Be interesting to see how that works all out too. I got one more tech topic today. Oh, cool. And the last but not least, the last tech topic this week is in relation to the AMD Navy Flounder graphics card. Flounder is basically, looks like, from what I've been led to believe, a GPU built specifically for Apple.
spotted in the Linux kernel.
Yeah, I mean, it's just basically, from what it looks like, it looks to be potentially a slightly cut down version of their
Trials, pros.
their current GPU design. It's going to be interesting to see how this actually plays out. Like I said, as far as it goes, it's again really niche product. It's going to be in a Apple product, so we're not obviously going to see probably
Tryhards everywhere.
any actual major release in relation to it. It'll just eventually just roll out in one of the Apple products eventually. It'll be interesting to see how this actually does stack up, obviously, but from a technical perspective, it's one of those situations where with the transition away from obviously x86 and over to ARM, it's going to be one of those situations where this product's probably going to have a very limited run cycle before it'll eventually be probably phased out. Anyway, that's pretty much the last topic. Do you guys want to discuss anything in relation to the Flounder?
But I think we've covered just about everything.
Yeah.
Any other topics that you just want to discuss this week?
I mean, not a whole lot happened, to be honest.
It has been a pretty slow news cycle.
Yeah.
We have actually had a very, very slow news cycle. And like I said, it's going to be one of those situations where I think it's going to be a relatively slow news cycle now, moving right through until close to the last quarter of this year. I think that's when probably get a few announcements, probably end of third quarter. But the products won't actually be launched, I don't think, until fourth quarter. There is talk that we're not going to see, obviously, the Zen 3 architecture on the desktop until sometime in 2021. It's only going to be Milan. I think that's going to be an interesting situation because, like, if AMD do push it out that long, it's going to be one of those things where it's going to obviously mean that Intel's going to have a little bit longer of a foothold, obviously, before the next performing products come out. But it's going to be an interesting roadmap just to see how it's going to pan out because the next generation of Intel chips is apparently going to have a decrease in cores, which is going to be an interesting situation where they're going to rely on their IPC improvements to obviously bridge the gap in terms of performance. Unless obviously they go down the path of keeping that. One other little tech topic is that Intel has actually killed off some of their X299 CPUs. So I mean, they haven't actually been out. So the Kirby Lake X 9th generation, not Kirby Lake, sorry. 9th gen mainstream. They're culling off those apparently at the moment, which is going to be an interesting situation. Like I said, I think that platform was dead on arrival when it refreshed it to the 10th gen, because I mean at that point that particular X299 socket was already essentially on its third essentially refresh. We had the 7th gen, they sort of skipped the 8th, brought out the 9th, and then of course released the 10th. And then of course the 10th gen just didn't really offer much in terms of anything viable in terms of performance. That's pretty much, like I said, it's a pretty much a non-issue because, like I said, the CPUs essentially were, like I said, dead on arrival. Yeah, it's interesting to see that them actually going down the path of discontinuing these chips so quickly, considering, like I said, that they haven't really been on the market for a very long time. Normally they leave their existing products on the market for a little bit longer but it'll be interesting to see why that they
She's invoice.
choose to kill this off so
Oh.
quickly. But I mean, like I said, it's not really surprising. Let's bring it up on there. Yeah, so the 9th generation Skylake X products, like I said, they weren't very compelling product to start with because they're only a couple of 100 megahertz faster than their predecessors. So it's not like that those were going to obviously offer very much in terms of a revolutionary performance gain. I'll just flick over to that. They're also discontinuing a few of their workstation Xeon platforms, CPUs. So that's going to be an interesting thing. This is brought over obviously by Tech Radar. Like I said, just phasing out those particular products. Pretty much a given since they don't compete anywhere in the product stack. Even their 10th gen, which I mean at this stage is a bit of a joke for availability. There's been a few tech sites that have been citing essentially a situation where Intel, even though they've got products released, getting a hold of one is absolutely almost impossible. And I mean, we've even seen that here where supply has been so constrained that it's weeks between obviously shipments and availability on how website. I think there is definitely a bit of a obviously issue with supply, and I mean I'm not sure if that's logistics because of obviously the whole human welfare situation, or if that's just purely because they can't get the chips out to the market quick enough. Be interesting to see which is which, but that's pretty much it for this week. Anything else that you want to discuss?
I'm good, homie.
Yeah. Same as Billy.
Well, that's it. We'll obviously leave it there, and we'll catch us all next week.
Yep. See you later.